Kia ora, Poke fam. Welcome to the Altaria Motive podcast, episode 2. I am your host, Kish, and I have got with me today Layton, Rumble, team captain of the Altaria Motive, and Vignesh Murthy. We had Vig on the podcast last week talking about his great special event run at the Melbourne special event. So if you haven't listened to that, definitely go back and check that one out. Vig talks a lot about the Rayquaza Vikavolt deck, so a great podcast to listen to. And so we've got Layton with us. Layton, why don't you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your history in the game, since this is your first time on the pod.
Well, first time on the pod, I'll make my first impression. I've been playing since kind of like Primal Clash, Phantom Forces era. I only broke into competitive play last year, and Oceania, like IC, was kind of like my main sort of competitive run. I started to like attend more tournaments and stuff. I was able to earn a Worlds invite that year as well, last year, and that was really good. I ended up getting 10th at Sydney Regionals in 2017. I won the Auckland Regionals as well, and I've just had kind of League Cup finishes and stuff in that season as too. This season, I played pretty casually because Nash was kind of far, even though it was an easier season to get an invite. It was more or less, I think, a lot of top placements was quite spread around to different people, so it was a bit harder to get an invite in New Zealand, as well as I've only really had the top 8 at the Auckland Special event with Lycanroc, Zoroark taking that weakness policy before everybody else did. So, yeah.
Yeah, bringing in the spice with the weakness policy. Too bad it's on the other side of the world, so we never get any recognition for anything. But anyway, Vig's going to take us through this week's topic. We try to have one topic on the podcast, maybe two, just a short, sharp 30 minutes on something we find interesting. So Vig, what's that topic this week?
Well, this week's topic is quite an interesting one. So with the rotation that just went by, we've noticed that there's been a distinct shift in the way decks are built. Previously, decks, every deck would see your standard 4 Professor Sycamore, 4N, and those were the key ways to draw cards to keep your deck flowing. But with the release of, with the rotation, there are a lot more sort of ability-based Pokemon that have been released, and players are shifting towards using them instead of using the relatively weaker supporters. So the topic for this podcast is that the way that the Pokemon Company wants its game to go forward, or will we see the return of powerful draw supporters in the future?
Yeah, we've definitely seen a shift. The loss of Sycamore and Bridget, all these powerful supporters, and been replaced by things like Tate and Liza, Cynthia, Judge. They're just not as powerful, basically, but we're seeing the Pokemon really come to the fore. We've seen Marshadow, things like that, get incorporated into a lot of decks. And Layton, I know you're pretty creative with your deck building. You're really liking Makago in your Buzzwole deck at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying Buzzwole, and enjoying Makago and Buzzwole decks at the moment and stuff. I did a Buzzwole GX Makago deck for the Melbourne special event, and from the testing and the prepping for that tournament, I realized Makago's a very good card because you just get to stack your deck, and it's not even for being able to use it on your turn. You can just use it to stack your deck at the end of your turn, so you're prepared for next turn as well. I think with the ability-based draw in that deck, it is more or less comboed off with supporter cards as well, because like cards like Kukui and Lily were pretty much key to like being able to draw cards without always having to discard. Acro Bike was really good, but as with Trash Launch in the meta, it was quite. It doesn't. Sometimes you work out discarding stuff that you don't want to discard. You get to awkward turns where you grab something that you want but you don't want it, sort of thing. But other abilities and stuff like Zoroark and Orangu and stuff are very good for draw.
Yeah, you touched on a very important point, which is the fact that you can stack your deck. So previously, you'd play all these draw supporters, and the purpose for drawing all these cards every turn was to see the cards you wanted to draw into, you know what I mean? But if you're able to just, stack your deck, get precisely the card you want every single turn, even if it's at the end of the turn or between your turn, and you draw using, you know, a card like Acro Bike or Oranguru or whatever, or even Zoroark's Trade. It smooths out the functionality of your deck, thereby reducing the need for your big draw supporters like Professor Sycamore or N.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was just gonna like touch on as well that like with these ability-based draws and stuff, I feel like it's definitely is a more of a search draw format than like a heavy impact draw, like a heavy draw format. Like with Octillery, when Octillery was around, a lot of decks would include that if they weren't playing Zoroark, just so they could have that draw and consistency of always being able to refresh their hand, discard a few cards, play down some view cards, draw 3 to 4 cards, play a supporter like Sycamore, draw 7 more cards. They kind of draw out quite a bit, but now you've got big hit 1 KO decks like Rayquaza and Magnezone sort of thing. Rayquaza using Vikavolt, searching out your energies instead of drawing into them, or using Max Elixir to go into them, because that's all rotated now. And like Magnezone using like Rubombi and Mount Coronet to draw the energies, and it's kind of focused on just using your initial setup to get into what you need now, kind of thing. Like it's all about setting up and searching.
Yeah, definitely. The Pokemon are the things that are pulling the bulk of the weight for decks now. You mentioned Rayquaza GX. I mean, the strongest play you can do with that deck is to Marshadow your opponent down to 4, and then Tempest GX yourself back up to 10. So Pokemon have really come to the fore. Previously, as you said, you just use the Sycamores and the Ends to draw into what you need. But now Pokemon have really taken over that role. And as you said, Zoroark and Oranguru are pretty much in most decks, I would think. If you're not playing Zoroark, you're probably playing Oranguru. I know those Buzz Shrine decks really rely on Oranguru just to draw. So what are some of the other abilities that you think might come to the fore, maybe once the format has matured a little bit, because it's still a little bit fresh? Big, are you liking anything in particular?
I wouldn't say I'm in love with this, but a lot of Stage 2 decks can sort of naturally fit in a 2/0/2 Swampert line. So Swampert, those of you who aren't aware, the ability is similar to Zoroark's Trade. You discard 1, but you get to draw 3 with Swampert. So this combos quite well with your Stage 2 decks, because you're already playing a full 4 rare candies, and with the format being slow enough, you have the time to set up an alternate Stage 2 line to supplement drawing throughout the game. The other issue that Stage 2 decks faced in the past was having to discard resources with Professor Sycamore, due to that being the only play that they could make at any given point in time. But with Swampert, you're able to pick and choose exactly the card to throw away, and you get to retain the resources that you need to then keep your chain going and to sustain attack after attack.
Yeah, for sure. I would suggest that you should always consider Swampert if you're playing a Stage 2 deck. It's just at least consider it. You may not end up playing it, but it's definitely a strong card. And with Super Boost energy as well, you can definitely capitalize on playing the Swampert, because it's an extra Stage 2. It means you don't need to get out 3 Gardevoirs or 3 Decidueyes or whatever like that. You can get the Swampert, and your opponent's never really going to target it down, because it's got a huge amount of hit points, 160 HP, and it's really just a 1 prizer, so they're never really going to target it down. So it will always be a Stage 2, which means that you only need to get out 2 other Stage 2s, which is pretty reasonable. And then you'll be able to use Super Boost, which is an incredibly powerful Prism Star card. So yeah, I really like Swampert. And I think a somewhat weaker version of Swampert is Ludicolo. Layton, I know you've got a fair bit of knowledge of Ludicolo. Do you think Ludicolo is a good card at the moment?
I love the card, but I don't think it's as good as I thought it was at the start of the format. It does work as like the 2005 deck did, but I feel like the 2005 deck, it had certain key cards that allowed it to work better than what Ludicolo and Makagu can do now as a deck together. Ludicolo, basically, if people don't know, has an ability that allows you to draw a card. You don't need to discard a card or anything like that, like Trade or Swampert's ability as well. You just need to just draw the card. It's pretty clutch in some ways, being able to like Acro Patch and attach, but relying on a double colorless and a water energy also to get going and attack and also be your draw. It becomes a bit fragile compared to something like a Swampert where you could have another stage 2 or another attacker in line attacking while you got your draw power on the bench. So I feel like that's what holds Ludicolo back, because you kind of go all in with the active Ludicolo sometimes. So you might have a lone Ludicolo, then you might get 2 out, but then you might not have the attachments to do. You get awkward turns and so forth with the deck, but it's a really fun budget deck if you guys want to play it and stuff.
Yeah, I remember back in the day when Ludicolo with Makago, both Pokemon having the same abilities as now, that was like one of the best decks in format, right? But what kept it one of the best decks in format was the speed of the format. A lot of players would argue that after rotation, most recently, we've seen a slower format, but I would argue that the format is not slow enough for a deck like Ludicolo to do really well. It's true what Layton said, that the ability to stack your deck and draw a card is broken with no downside, by the way. It is really broken in any format. But even in a slow format, when you're competing against decks like Rayquaza that can on the second turn, start taking knockouts, that's really difficult to keep up with. So I don't see Ludicolo being a particularly sort of influential card while it's in the standard format.
One other thing you need to take a note of, I believe, is that Swoop Teleporter was a big card back in the Ludicolo decks back in the day. You could run your 4 Dunsparce and be able to use Swoop Teleporter, and if you don't know what Swoop Teleporter does, if you know a card called Ninja Boy, but as an item, basically it has a similar effect of being able to search your deck for a basic and replace it with one of your other basics on the bench or even active, and then you're able to discard the card that you are switching with, and then you put the new card back in play. So basically you could have your Dunsparce there, Swoop Teleport it for a Slugma, and then you have the Slugma already started, and you can then evolve into Makago. I feel like if they had that card in format, it would definitely be more of a contender than what it is at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, it just doesn't have the tools that it did back then. Back then, people had large hand sizes, so you could use Steven's advice, which lets you draw a card for every Pokemon your opponent has, and copycats. Large hand sizes mean that you're able to hit those combos better, and we do have larger hand sizes now, but there are more burnable items, so your opponent can just play them down. But anyway, I guess one of the cool things I've found with this shift towards more Pokemon-based support is that the standard supporter lines in decks, there is no standard supporter line in decks, apart from for Cynthia. It seems everything else is fair game. Some people play Copycat, some people play Judge, How, well, I don't think anyone plays How, but Tate and Liza, Volkner, things like this.
Let's not forget Steven's Resolve as well.
Yes, how could we forget Steven's Resolve? Underrated card, especially with N gone. So, what are your guys' opinions on this? Is this something you like, or is this something you don't like because now you just don't have the supporter line? You don't know what the optimal supporter line is. What do you think?
I guess Pokemon has always been printing creative supporters, but often these creative supporters were not strong enough to trump Professor Sycamore and N, so therefore we never saw them being played, like in the large scale. But now it's quite different. You've got supporters that have a lot of synergy with specific decks. Like, for example, you've got Volkner that fits right in with a deck like Vicare, to search out your rare candies or your energy recyclers, and also get an energy in hand to hit the numbers that you need. Or Stevens, that goes really well in a deck like Metagross. These supporters might not sort of fit into every single deck, despite their effects being strong, but within their own niche, they can be quite good.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think that's a great point. a lot of niche supporters are seeing more play now. Kukui to help Zoroark get to 180 with Devoured Field, things like that. So it's very cool, I think, that the format is still unsolved in terms of what the best supporter lines are for certain decks. You could almost justify most things. I think most people will agree that turn 1 Lily / Stevens is probably like the best thing you can do, but aside from that, people really don't have any idea. So
one thing that I want to highlight that absolutely drills the point home about what you just said there, Kish, is that at the recent regionals in Brazil, where the SPAS deck, so that's the single price attacker with shrine decks, it totally took over. So 3 of the top 4 placing decks were the Buzzwole, Garbodor, Shrine of Punishment deck. Now, what was interesting when I looked at those lists was that all of them played Tate and Liza, but all of them played different counts of Tate and Liza. So the first place deck played 4 Tate and Liza, which is a surprising count to most people. I think the second place played a single copy, and the third or the fourth place deck played 2. So even though they were all playing the same deck, which with the same inherent sort of strategy behind getting the attacks flowing, it was really interesting to see the different sort of emphasis that the players decided to put with regards to their supporter. So obviously the first place player valued the switching effect of Tate and Liza way more than some of the other players. So sort of this kind of alternate mentality that can come about by having so much flexibility in the supporter spots is really healthy for the format.
Yeah, I think so. You can definitely put your spin on a deck now and definitely cater to what you think is the most important, and you can really reap the rewards from that if you do it well and with some good testing. So yeah, do you guys, Layton, do you like the direction that Pokemon's going? Things have slowed down. Pokemon are taking over more than the supporters. Is this a good thing?
I do like it, but I think I dislike the lack of disruption and like hand disruption, like as much as I hate in or being in down to 1 when in was in format, I feel like sometimes it's a little bit needed, but in this format, I feel like it could be too much of a swing around. Like I feel like something like an Ace Trainer might be a bit more flexible as a supporter if it was brought back into this format, just because it gives you 6 and gives them 3, so it does make the opponent wonder about taking the first KO, but then people wouldn't run that many copies of it because it's kind of like a counter energy, so it might be a 1 to 2 of, so it would probably replace Judge, I imagine. But in saying that, I feel like the format's kind of like it can be quite dominant if you hit support draw supporter every turn and energy every turn, you should be good up throughout the whole game. But missing those supporters like Sycamore or back in the day, like depending on the type of deck you're playing, it like hurt a bit, but you could always kind of catch up in a way with Sycamore sort of thing, because you draw 7 cards, you're discarding a few cards, and you're kind of thinning your deck. Now I feel like sometimes with these Symphias and Tate and Lisas, shuffling in back those cards that you have in your deck and then drawing, you're not thinning as fast as normal, so you kind of, it is becoming a bit of a slow game in that sense. But yeah, like having like people in the recent Philadelphia regionals and stuff, like playing one Hala and that sort of stuff is quite cool and unique. I quite like it.
Yeah, it's some interesting points you raised there. How you didn't necessarily like that you could sort of almost brick and not have a comeback. I got a couple of opinions on that. One is that I think ties will actually become much less likely now because N drags the game out so much, because you could end your opponent down to 2 or 1, and then that would buy another few turns for you to come back and maybe even win the game. So it really like stretches games out. And also you wouldn't scoop early because you had that option to end and stay in the game. So whereas now I think I know Vig definitely did it in Melbourne, where he would just scoop after like 2 turns if he just saw the writing on the wall. So I feel like that's a good thing for the game, in my opinion. I really don't like ties. So
yeah, I don't like ties either.
Yep.
yeah, so I think that will shorten games, so maybe you will be able to fit a best of 3 into 50 minutes. And the other thing is that it presents a lot of interesting in-game decisions if you know that your supporters are suboptimal. So, for example, when I'm playing Zorak, say I have a Cynthia in hand, but I have a Zorak which I can evolve to next turn, I might forego playing that Cynthia because I know I have a Zorak to evolve into. So there's a lot of like micro decisions. I feel like it introduces a lot of micro decisions, which adds an extra element of skill into the game. Whereas before you would just, whatever, I'll just Sycamore. I'll draw what I need anyway because I have such powerful draw supporters to fall back on. So I think, in my opinion, it's a good thing. I hear what you say about the lack of disruption, but I think that's almost a good thing because for such a long period of time in the game, there hadn't been disruption except for maybe Judge for a period in Heart Gold, Soul Silver. So, well, I'm talking about prior to N being printed. There was Rocket's admin, which is also N. But yeah. So.
There's also a gap in the rotation, like I think it was maybe like 26. It was like just before.
Yeah, there was 6 months or so.
Was printed and stuff. I think it was back in like 2016. It was for 6 months. It was like XY onwards, and Judge was the only disruption, like hand disruption card, and people were playing like 1 to 2 because you had VSC anyway. And it just kind of comes down to the same time that like type of games that is now, where you're like, oh, okay, I have Lysander, sweet, okay, you win because you can't like disrupt it because you already played down your Judges beforehand and things like that. You kind of run out of steam in some ways.
There's an aspect of disruption though at the moment that I like quite a bit, which is that previously if you're losing a game and you play your N and you end your opponent down to 1 while you're drawing 6, there's a clear advantage to you and a clear disadvantage to your opponent, right? But that if you think about it, your opponent's in that position because their deck's done well. It's done, they've been able to execute their strategy well enough to the point where they're just 1 prize away from winning. In which case, I don't think there should be as easily accessible of an option for their opponent to pick them back. You know what I mean? But when playing a card like Judge, for example, because both players are drawing 4, there's an equal likelihood that the player playing it in order to disrupt is also handicapped by playing it. So they have to make a real conscious decision about, hey, if I have to play this Judge to get the Guzma out of my opponent's hand, but there's a very real possibility that I'm not going to get the cards I need either to win the game or progress my game state. So I feel like this kind of decision making is a bit more fair almost to players who are doing well in a game, and it sort of increases the skill gap, and therefore players that are inherently more skilled should be winning games more often.
And less chance sort of based as well, sort of thing. Because I get what you mean, like Kish was saying before, where maybe I might not play my Cynthia just yet if I've got my Zorak in hand. It's sort of little plays like that. It has kind of like add up, I feel. Like you kind of, now you're more or less keen to, I might just chill this turn and just wait and see how it goes, instead of being hesitant to always keep drawing. Like if you have a Sycamore or in, just like play Sycamore, see more cards. But now you're kind of more like, I'm okay with the cards I have in hand, and it's kind of a conscious decision of, will my cards get better with how big the deck is, or will my hand get worse?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that, Layton. Like, you have to pick your spots now when you want to play certain cards. Like, even Marshadow, timing your Marshadow is pretty critical. If you decide to play it on turn 1 and your opponent hits a Lele and they just draw straight out of it, well, you've just wasted your disruption for the whole game. So you might have just wasted your whole disruption for the whole game. So picking your spots is really, really important. So I think that definitely does introduce a lot of skill. And back to your point, Layton, maybe Ace Trainer might be a good option. If Vig says it's a bit unfair to end to 1, then maybe Ace Trainer is a bit more balanced. We'll see if Pokemon decides to go that way. So I think, have you guys got anything you want to add at the end here? I think we're getting towards the end of our time. We've had a pretty productive discussion. I think some really good points made. Have you guys got anything you want to add?
I really like how Marshadow's being splashed in, because the common drawback that we talk about with Judge is the fact that you're handicapping yourself, but you're also using up your supporter for the turn. That is quite a big sort of drawback to disrupt your opponent. But Marshadow, it's so accessible. In Ultra Ball, every deck plays Ultra Ball, and so many decks play Mysterious Treasure. You can find Marshadow easy enough, and it gives you that disruption option, but allows you to keep your turn going, despite having drawn with the Judge effect. But you can play your Lilies and your Cynthias to keep your turn going. So Marshadow, I don't see it going out of the format anytime soon, not unless there's another better sort of disruption card that comes out.
Yeah, I can agree with that as well. I feel like Marshadow and Judge will be... I feel like you need to judge certain decks on certain turns, such as like Metagross with maybe using a Stevens or a Algorithm.
Yeah, for sure.
Algorithm, yeah. Just like on those certain turns, I feel like you do need to be playing your supporters down and being able to trying to stop them getting ahead, but it doesn't stop them getting not too ahead in some ways, because most of the time you can draw out of it because the opponent's always getting 5 cards at the end of the Judge because they'll draw the card for their turn. So it's kind of like a bit of a more manageable disruption.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, it's not an automatic decision to judge someone if they have Stevens, especially sort of mid-game, because you probably have a good hand. So do you want to get rid of your good hand just to get rid of, what's the 3 worst cards that they can get for you? That's sort of the thinking that you have to have now, that the format has grown in this way, or has developed in this way. So I know I've played a few games on PTCGO where they've done an algorithm with 1 Metagross GX, and I'm like, well, there's nothing really they can get that's going to hurt me, so I'm just going to keep my hand and just, keep going. So, so it's pretty interesting. I like the direction that Pokemon has taken myself. And, so if that's all that you guys have to say about it, I think we'll wrap it up here. Thanks very much for joining me. So for Layton, Vig, and myself, Kish, this has been the Altaria Motive podcast. Thanks for listening, guys. Thanks for tuning in. We hope to have a lot more content, weekly podcasts, so stay tuned. And remember, ties are the real enemy. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Hi everyone, Kish here. On this week's episode, I've got Vig and Layton with me to discuss a really exciting topic. Don't forget to give us a like on Facebook, follow our Twitch, and if you've got any ideas for some interesting Pokemon TCG topics, definitely leave a comment on our Facebook page, and who knows, we might be discussing your topic on our next pod. Cheers, hope you enjoy. Kia ora, PokeFam. Welcome to the Altaria Motive Podcast, Episode 3. On this week's episode, we will be discussing Japan's format. What is it, and would the rest of the world benefit from a similar format? So if you don't know what we're about, we're a team from New Zealand, and each week on the podcast, we discuss one interesting topic. So if you haven't heard our other 2 episodes, definitely go back and check them out. But this week, we'll be talking about Japan's format. So what is Japan's format? Well, they play a best of 1, 30 minutes plus 0 turns. So it's a pretty interesting format and pretty brutal as well. So when time is called, the player whose turn it is gets to finish their turn. And if that player was the person who went first, then the other player who went second gets an additional turn. However, if time was called on the player's turn who went second, then that player finished their turn and the game is over. So an interesting thing to note about that format is if the game's not completed, so that is neither player has taken all their prize cards, then both players are given a loss. So there are no ties in Japan. So pretty brutal, pretty interesting, and I think a great topic for this week's podcast. So one of the potential benefits of a best of 1 30 minutes format is that we get to play more rounds. So as we all know, we play best of 3 50 minutes. So for 2 rounds, say, that would take an hour 40. But in Japan, you could complete 3 rounds in that time, being an hour and a half, and then have 10 minutes left over. So this means that days are not as long, not as grindy, players wouldn't get as fatigued, and you'd finish at a reasonable time. It's common for American regionals to go a whole day. You start at 9 and then finish at 11. I mean, that's just crazy. But in Japan, they can start at a reasonable time, 9, and play maybe like 8 or 9 rounds, and that'll take up maybe 4.5, 5, 6 hours, and then be finished at like 4. So it's pretty amazing that you can play so much Pokemon in such a short amount of time. And of course, the benefit is that we might be able to include things like lunch breaks, refreshments. Players can, get rehydrated, eat something decent, not be starving through the day. So it is pretty interesting. It's also interesting to note that in Japan and Korea, they have tiered tournaments. So they have these things called gym challenges, which are sort of similar to league challenges that we have, but they can hold them on weekends or even sometimes midweek after work, or even have multiple on the same day, basically because you can play many rounds in a short amount of time. So say in the 3 hours after work, you could play 6 rounds potentially, whereas that doesn't really happen in a best of 3 50 minutes format. So I think it's a pretty interesting format and something that I like. Big, are there any other pros that you see from Japan's format being best of 130 minutes?
I think the fact that players can play more rounds means inherently there's a lot less variance in the matchups that people face during the day. There's a lot less weight given to a single round. So decks, for example, players might build decks that would take auto losses to certain other decks in the meta and hope to avoid pairing against them in a tournament on the western side of Pokemon. But however, in Japan, because you're playing way more rounds, there's a higher likelihood that you would come up against these decks. So therefore, that is a consideration you need to make when building your deck in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, less variance is an interesting thing. So say if you're in a tournament and you're playing like Zorak or something like that, and you just happen to hit a Buzzwole deck, in the West, that would be basically 1 round loss for you, and you might only be playing 5 rounds, so the best you can do is 4-1. But in Japan, you'd probably have double the amount of rounds, so the best you could do is maybe 8-1, which might be a much better record. So I think it's interesting in that, the less weight is given to a single round. So, and also, you get a better sampling of the meta. So, as I said, if you hit that 1 Buzzwole deck, you might be unlucky. The room might be full of Malamar, but you just happen to hit that 1 Buzzwole. But if there's more rounds, then you're obviously going to hit more of the Malamar decks, and maybe the better meta choice will show through in the end.
I think more rounds really rewards a good deck builder. There are players like Takuya Yoneda who have consistently done really well in Japan's best-of-1 format because they're able to come up with innovative decks that are able to thrive in a best-of-1 format playing against a wide-open field. So it really rewards people who are able to read the meta really well and able to come prepared to a tournament with the deck ready to win.
So within saying that and stuff as well, is that with the less time in each round of the best of 1 format compared to a best of 3 format, having 30 minutes to complete a game, you are kind of end up being skewed into playing a bit faster because there is instead of when you get tie into a round, you don't tie in Japan. You get eliminated in the sense of you both get a loss. So this encourages people to play with a pace and play just that bit faster and efficiently instead of taking their time. And maybe some people slow play in the West and stuff if they're playing an unfavorable matchup, so they can try bring that matchup into a tie. Well, that sort of idea is basically eliminated in Japan. But with the time to complete each round, you honestly also see on stream as well, is that they complete their games within at least 20 minutes compared to in the West, the best of 3 rounds, they normally do go into time. It's like you see on the Pokemon streams, about like 50% of the time, there will always be like a tie and it goes into time and then there's no result. But on the streams and stuff in Japan, especially the latest tournament, you saw the rounds, they go for, they normally went to 20 minutes. They didn't do the full 30 minutes. They had at least 10 minutes left on the clock. And they also do play with that 30-minute time in each round in the top cut as well. So you don't get that extended time period like you do in top cut in the West.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing to say about that is that with the 30 minutes, there's actually more time per game in Japan than there is in the West. So best of 350 minutes, you're looking at less than 20 minutes per game, somewhere like 17 minutes per game sort of thing. Whereas in Japan, you have a full 30 minutes to complete a game. So that's plenty of time to complete the game. And you're not stuck in this situation where you can't complete a round. And like you said, Layton, a lot of the ties are seen on stream, and that's pretty unsatisfying as a viewer to actually see a tie. You want to see someone win and you want to see someone lose. You like that result of there being a winner, but a tie is just very vanilla. It leaves you kind of feeling empty. At least it does for me when I watch that. Yeah. So.
Yeah, totally. Me too. But one thing that really stood out for me was at the 2016 Worlds Finals, I was sitting in the audience watching the juniors final, and it so happened that both the finalists for juniors that year were two players from Japan. And it was insane watching these two young players, less than 10 years old, playing a God of War mirror at frightening speed. It was hard for me, an experienced player, to actually keep up and follow what they were doing. And that really highlighted just how well trained they were in playing quickly in their format.
Yeah, definitely. And it definitely bodes well for them coming to Worlds as well, coming from Japan, because they probably could get through a best of 3 because they're so used to playing so fast. So yeah, and then the other thing is that there's no ties, there's no IDs as well. Are you guys big fans of IDs? I'm not a huge fan of them. I don't think you should be able to play like 3/4 of the tournament and then just be able to ID into cut. Like everyone should play all the rounds and then the best players go through into the top cut. Are you guys fans of IDs at all?
I don't mind the ID concept at all, because as long as draws are a feature of the tournament, that's part of the rules, then IDs are fair game, because what you're essentially saying by IDing is that you're allowing the players to not sort of draw past for 50 minutes and then call it a draw, instead of just saying, okay, let's draw right at the start of the game, and you have the time to go get a round of coffee or something. You know what I mean? So I think the real issue with IDs is the fact that they award points towards the later half of the tournament, and regardless of how other players do in the last few rounds, you're guaranteed in. So this is where Japan's format of basically having to be nearly undefeated works really well, in that it doesn't encourage people to draw. Even if you could draw, you wouldn't take that option, because you know that every single round is crucial.
Yeah, definitely. Layton, are you a fan of IDs at all?
I am a fan of IDs in a best of 3 format, because in a best of 1 format, if you were able to ID, you're able to ID instead of you win or you lose, it kind of switches around the points in the sense of you can just, it's the same thing of a best of 3, that you could win 3/4 of your rounds of the day and then ID the rest in the top cut, and that gives you sort of that sense of I'm able to relax a bit, take it a bit easy, because there is that more time in the day of the best of 3 format. You're playing to 50 minutes instead of 30 minutes. But I feel like these ties are unnecessary in a best of 1 format compared to a best of 3 format, is what I'm trying to get around to say.
Yeah. But I guess the other thing to say is that by just playing that sort of format eliminates ties, and then you also eliminate a lot of the controversy that we've seen in the West about how ties are resolved, especially later in tournaments. Players can try and figure out who's better on board, and then one player will scoop to another, or they'll randomize, which is illegal, to flip a coin or roll a dice to decide the winner. So it takes away all of this sort of nonsense from the game and factors which aren't really important to the game itself. It's just two players trying to somehow get into top cut, but the result of the game doesn't reflect the result that they're going to write down on the paper, and it basically takes away a lot of the confusion, I think. So I think that's one benefit of no ties, but it's not all rosy. There definitely are some things to consider before just considering Japan's format as the best thing, because there are definitely some cons. What do you guys reckon, Vig? What are some of the cons of playing this sort of format?
I think the biggest drawback is that there's a very real possibility of being knocked out of tournaments or losing rounds because of dead draws or donks. So obviously this is a reality of playing Pokemon. We're playing a game of randomized cards, and sometimes you just don't draw the cards you need from time to time. To win a tournament, in addition to luck, you need a consistent deck. So what we often see in Japan is that players adapt their decks. They don't play decks that are susceptible to draw dead because of not drawing enough Pokemon. They don't play decks that are susceptible to donks. But sometimes the calculated risk that they take can pay off and do well in a tournament. It really is a thinking man's game when it comes to bringing a deck to a tournament in Japan.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people now are complaining that there's not enough comeback potential because N is rotated. Well, there's no comeback potential if you get donked. So, whereas in our format, best of three, well, hey, you might still have time to complete 2 games if you get donked within the first couple of minutes. So that's definitely a drawback.
I think there's another benefit in that, given a best of 3 format, there's a better likelihood for the better deck to win the round. For example, if you're up against an auto loss, there's a chance that the auto loss deck dead draws and you're able to steal a win. Now, the reality is, in that matchup, the auto loss deck should be beating you more often than not, and therefore that should technically be the result that reflects at the end of the round. That is what we'll see in a best of 3 format when compared to a Japanese format.
Yeah, I can also agree with those points as well, Vig. And also you do get sometimes this elimination of certain archetypes as well. Like if we're looking at the Japanese championships that was XY to Celestial Storm, you did see some item lock decks, which was Decidueye Toad, and then you did see some form of control decks like an Espeon Garb. But they were very much in the 1s and 2s and stuff compared to something like a Quad Sylveon, which would do quite well in a best of 3 in the West in that type of format, just because of being able to mill someone out is a lot easier in 50 minutes compared to a 30 minutes. So archetypes like mill is kind of more redundant in Japan just because of that shorter time.
Yeah, you're
so
absolutely
you kind of
right.
do see a less decks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Because in a best of 3 format, you can get by winning the round by winning just the first game. So archetypes like Sylveon Mill that you mentioned, you can just play a long drawn out game 1 that takes 45 minutes for you to win, and then the second game of the best of 3 goes to time, and you win the round. But that concept doesn't really exist in Japan, and therefore those types of decks are often non-existent at tournaments.
Yes, it's because of when you also run out of time in Japan as well, you'll end up losing the game. So it's kind of that sort of mentality is kind of seen in the decks that people play.
Yeah, definitely. You can't almost win in Japan. You have to win. Otherwise, you don't win. You lose. So I think that I'd be quite happy with that. I don't particularly like sitting across the table from Sylveon Mill and sitting there for 45 minutes while my deck gets milled out and all my energy gets discarded. So I think I would be quite happy with the elimination of those sort of mill, stally sort of decks.
But I think a real problem with the best of 1 format is it really comes down often to whoever is the winner of the coin flip. Kish, is it too much of an advantage for a player to win the coin flip in Japan?
Yeah, so naturally with one game, winning the 1 coin flip is going to put you at a massive advantage compared to your opponent. They do try and mitigate that with the time rules, where the player going second gets an additional turn once time is called, but it's definitely a massive advantage. But I don't really see it as that much of an advantage compared to our best of 3, because in best of 3, the player who wins the coin flip is still at an advantage because you win the first game, presuming you do because you won the coin flip. then you lose the second game, and then you win the third game. So you still get to go first in the third game. So the coin flip is the coin flip. It will always be an advantage to whoever wins it. I don't really think it's that much of an advantage. And also, like we said before, you're playing a lot of rounds, so you'd expect that luck to average out over more rounds, more flips, more likely to be 50-50. So I don't really see it as being a huge con, but I can see the argument for it. If you're having a bad run and you're going second a lot of the day, you're going to have a bad day. So yeah, I think we're coming towards the end of the podcast now. What would you guys like to see? Do you like Japan's format? Do you like our format? What do you guys prefer? Fig?
Bit of background. I started playing in 2013 when in New Zealand, best of one was the format, but it was best of one with draws. I really liked that format because you're able to get through a lot of games quickly, but you still had enough time to find the correct winner for the matchup. You're right in that some decks just didn't exist because there wasn't enough time to get wins with them, but I feel like, generally speaking, higher skilled, faster players are able to find wins in a best of one format. It rewards good deck building and good meta reading, and you're able to get through more rounds in a day, so therefore you need to be able to build decks that are able to face a wider variety of decks. And I feel like there's a lot more skill involved in that type of format, or a different type of skill, wouldn't necessarily say a lot more. So that's definitely my preference, a best of one format with draws.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I am somewhat of the opposite. I prefer best of one with no draws. As you know, I really dislike ties. I really don't like IDs and things like that. And that's probably because my background was, when I started, there were no ties. So basically you play, it's still best of three, but if you were tied at one game each, you'd play a sudden death game. And that definitely affected deck choices for tournaments. You might choose a deck that's better in sudden death. I know I definitely did back in the day, just because it has that advantage in sudden death. So I prefer Swiss best of round, no draws, and then you get to play more rounds, better sampling of the meta. You might get a lunch break in there, which is great, and the day is overall shorter. But then once you get to top cut, a best of three format, so that you're not stuck with these sort of donks. Like you work hard the whole day to make it to top 8 or top 16 or whatever, and then you just get donked and you're out of the tournament. So I still like having the best of three in top cut, because then I really think the best deck will shine through. And if you actually have built a deck with top cut in mind, you're so confident that you're going to make top cut that you are playing a deck that's better in best of three. You might have struggled your way through the Swiss rounds, but then you really reap the rewards in top cut. And I think power to you if you can do that. If you can find a deck that does somehow make it through best of one and then just dominates in best of three, then that's great. Good on you. Layton, what about you? What do you reckon?
I reckon a best of one tournament structure for special events and more league cups and more league challenges would be quite good. I quite like the idea of our special events around the world being a best of one, compared to and having the regionals at a best of three, and same with internets. Just because I feel special events should have some form of differentiation between regionals and itself, just because currently it's just money is the only difference between a special event and a regionals. I feel like in a sense of there should be a different type of way we play those special events compared to regionals. I do like your idea as well of having a best of three for top cut, especially for the special events as well, if they were going to be best of one. But I would have to probably also go with no draws as well, because for best of one, because I feel like drawing your games is really good in the sense that you could draw and finish out the day. But I feel like with a best of one format, like I said previously, was that you don't really need to draw. You don't need to ID when you're only playing 30 minutes each round. I feel like it's better to play it out and see actually which deck would actually be victorious throughout the whole day, instead of being about I can win my first few games and then ID into the cut. So yeah, that's why I feel like would be quite good.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting point. So best of one for certain tournaments, like certain levels of tournaments. Nothing worse than playing like a 8-hour League Cup or something. So that's a pretty interesting point. I can definitely get on board with that.
Yeah, I would like definitely would like best of 1 for special events, but definitely I would like to keep regionals as best of 3 and same with internets, because I feel like it is what we are used to, and I do like that tournament structure. But best of 1 for special events and more League Cups and more League Challenges, just because it's a lot easier to just play and like have time in your day. That's the main thing that I find, and you don't get exhausted as quickly and stuff if you're playing like a best of 1.
Yeah, definitely. Interestingly, Japan does still play best of 1 30 minutes and top cuts. They are pretty cutthroat over there. So they really, really deck choice is very important over there. And like Vig said earlier, consistency in your deck is massive.
Yeah, well, in Japan, in addition to needing a really consistent and good deck and one that takes into account the whole meta, you also need a deck that, you know, can fly on the day. You need some luck that works in your favor to win that tournament, because it is really cutthroat to win all those games in a game that has some form of randomization in it. Would require some luck. So I guess you have to give yourself the best chance possible to win a tournament, and you do that by building consistent decks, and you just hope that luck favors you on the day.
Yeah, luck is definitely a massive part of the game, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it makes it more exciting that there is some luck in the game. Not too much, but just a little bit makes it definitely interesting, keeps it spicy. You see like Tord trade into double puzzle. That's like, whoa, it's mind-blowing sort of stuff. So
yeah, those moments you don't get without some sort of randomization, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I think we're at our time limit. So thanks very much for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Definitely check out our Facebook page. We also stream on Twitch sometimes, so give us a follow there. And we do tweet now and again, so keep an eye out for that, and definitely keep an ear out for our upcoming podcasts. So thanks very much for joining us. For myself, Vig, and Layton, this has been the Altaria Motive podcast. See ya.
See you later.
See ya.